If you are a regular listener to the Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to continue keep the show going and growing. Best wishes and keep enjoying the show.
Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and in each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research and their experiences. So put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show podcast. My guest for this episode is Professor Angela McRobbie from Goldsmiths University. Angela is someone that I'd wanted to get on the show for quite a while now. And because of her extensive career and research, she's kindly agreed to do a two-part episode. So in this first part, we're going to look at Angela's early career, looking at her research from the mid-70s through to the late 80s. So Angela, firstly, thank you very much for coming onto the show.
Well, I'm delighted to be part of it, and it's great that you're doing it. So thank you for inviting me.
Oh, no, it's fantastic to have you on. And I should ask, with reason, how are you, Angela?
Well, I'm one of the people, unfortunately, who have had C19 pneumonia. I was in an ICU for 5 days. I'm very thankful to the NHS who looked after me. I'm very grateful that I survived, and it's now 5 months after I was discharged, and I still have a bewildering array of peculiar symptoms, but I am getting slowly better. And this last week, I've been back swimming, and this has helped me a lot. I think it's also released endorphins. So,
yes.
And I went to an aqua aerobics class with music, and I thought, oh, this is great. So I think I've turned a corner.
Fantastic. Delighted to hear you're on the road to recovery. That's really good to hear. So let's find out where it all began for you. I know you said your first research is kind of mid-70s. Where did the subject of sociology start for you, though, Angela?
Okay, well, I did my first degree at Glasgow University, 1969. And at that time, it wasn't possible to do sociology as a single honours degree or even as a single BA ordinary degree. It could only be combined with another more mainstream discipline. And actually, I was always somebody who had lent towards English literature. So at the same time, the really good thing about Glasgow University is that in the first year, one did 5 subjects. So it was really fantastic to have that breadth of choice. So I did French, English, chemistry, drama. I've forgotten, how many. And then it wasn't until either year 2 or year 3 that I did sociology. And I really fell in love with sociology, I have to say, because it was so refreshing. It was so alive. It was so connected to all the things that I had kind of observed while I was growing up as a teenager in middle-class Glasgow. And it kind of really nurtured recognition that there could be a validity in studying everyday life, and that what went on around one was a legitimate subject for investigation. And of course, I grew up in Glasgow, which is and was always a working class city. And I grew up in the green outskirts of the city, but there was always a kind of sense of which one recognized and acknowledged disadvantage, poverty, unemployment, and hardship. And so doing sociology at that radical moment, that was like 1971, really gave me an idea that this had a kind of political relevance and an importance, in the way that, much knows, I loved doing English. English at that time was still steeped in the classics and in the great canon. And there was a sense in which you had to work through the great canon to maybe get as far as Virginia Woolf. And I was interested in contemporary culture, politics, and life.
Yeah. And you just mentioned Virginia Woolf. Who else was inspiring you at the time when you studied sociology?
Well, when I studied sociology, that's a really good question. So sociology in Glasgow was young. It was very radical. I would say that, of course, there were the classics, Marx, Weber, Durkheim. There was a very strong Marxist influence across the department. There was the beginning of a feminist sociology presence. And I have to thank my various teachers, Bridget Fowler, Barbara Littlewood. And there was also some fantastic early work being done on sexual politics, on what was then called gay liberation. And there was also, however, I think perhaps really the most striking thing when I was at Glasgow was the increasingly focused work on deviance and on criminology. And that really had a strong kind of root in Scotland. And obviously that's since become one of the defining features of Scottish sociology. But there was a strong interest in prisons, in football hooligans, and I think we were all impressed by what was it called? The new criminology.
Yes.
And I remember Paul Walton arrived in Glasgow for a couple of years. And, he was the pioneer of the new criminology, along with Jock Young, who was in London. And so that really kind of, I wouldn't say it gave me an immediate pathway for my future research, but it was certainly a field of study that was interested in young people and youth culture. And then, of course, we read Stan Cohen.
Yes.
So that was, a major work. The other things we read is Anne Oakley, of course. Her earliest work was just being produced in the mid-70s, early 70s. So we read Anne Oakley. We read everything that was coming out of the new criminology, particularly Stan Cohen. We didn't really, another question would be about the sociology of media that was just beginning to develop. I left Glasgow in 1974. So at that time, there really wasn't such a thing as the sociology of media. But it was being developed by Greg Filer, who was a postgraduate and who then set up the Glasgow Media School, Glasgow Media Group. And I would say that was important and interesting work, but it wasn't really exactly what I wanted to do myself. So when I left Glasgow, I really found myself pulled in two directions. I loved literature, but I was interested in contemporary popular literature, such as girls' magazines. And that really was a subject that had no recognition or legitimacy at that time. So I was definitely interested in this whole world of magazines, Vogue magazine, Jackie magazine, and how powerful they were in their address to women. So as a young feminist, I loved classical literature, but I was more interested in these kind of new cultural phenomena. In sociology, there wasn't really such a strong feminist interest in popular culture. So I had to really I had to go to Birmingham in order to be able to formulate a proper subject of research.
Thank you. And let's start with one of the things you just mentioned, your research into girls' magazines. That's probably how I first heard of you, and I think how many A-level sociology students will know you from, your research into magazines such as Jackie. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that research?
Yeah, absolutely. So I went to Birmingham in 74, and it was a very kind of radical, informal place. And there was a lot of emphasis on doing work in groups and in co-authoring articles incredibly early in one's career. So one was working in this kind of collective environment, publishing pamphlets, writing short articles with 3 or 4 people. And that was very empowering. It was very good for one's confidence as a very junior postgraduate student. However, by 1976, when I had my daughter, I began to think I must have a career. I must do my own work. And I had already formulated this topic on Jackie magazine. And so I remember very clearly gathering together, I must have collected them over the years. I had a huge, vast pile of these magazines from probably about 73 to 76. And I was interested in studying them because they really were popular on a mass basis at that time. It was certainly widely recognized that almost their reach was extraordinary, their readership. Almost every single young girl in the UK at that time either read the magazine or read their sisters' magazines or read their friends' magazines. So it was a huge, wide reach of a form of media. And so I really wanted to focus on it and try and understand, how does it work? What's going on? What is the source of its popularity? How dangerous is it? How detrimental is it to young women's future ideas about what they could be or what they could do? And it was really fantastic being in Birmingham University at that time, because the work of Stuart Hall and the other colleagues at Birmingham just gave me a vocabulary to do that. And the vocabulary they gave me was one that was not wholly within sociology. It was really on the edge of sociology, because I wanted to be able to understand the inner workings of the magazine, not just the kind of content analysis approach that might say, well, 99% of covers of the magazine have got this kind of young woman on it. I wanted to kind of really dig deeper than that and understand how the politics of meaning was being constructed week in, week out. I was interested in repetition and sameness. I was interested in, because I remember it, the idea that familiarity was really an important part of young girls and indeed of children's culture. And in those days, a magazine came through the letterbox every week, or in one case, in my case, one's father brought it home from work, because one's mum didn't work, but one's father would bring home comics every single week for myself and my sisters from about the age of 7. So there was a sense in which I felt that the methodology I needed had to come from somewhere other than the content analysis approach that the sociology of media was developing at the time. So thanks to Stuart Hall, I was introduced to the work of Roland Barthes, the French semiologist, Louis Althusser, the French Marxist philosopher, and the Italian Marxist Gramsci. And basically, I didn't have much time to do it. I was running out of time. I had a little child in the nursery. And so really, in quite a systematic way, I sat and found a way of applying 2 or 3 of those concepts from Barthes, from Althusser, and from Gramsci to the magazine. And I used the idea of the code. I used the idea of the ideology of adolescent femininity. And I used Gramsci's idea of hegemony in terms of how you produce consent and enjoyment and identification and pleasure. And of course, I added to that a feminist vocabulary. And they really permitted me, allowed me. So in some ways, it was quite experimental. I was thinking, and I mean, I was very young. I didn't really, I thought, well, Barthes is way up there. Althusser is, in the Sorbonne. And Stuart Hall has read all this stuff. So it was kind of quite a lot of effort. But in the end, I thought, okay, really, I want this to be a contribution to feminist knowledge, because I also can see that this is harmful to young women. And I think what comes across from that work still is the dominant theme in it, the argument, is the ideology of romance is pernicious to young women, particularly young working class women who don't necessarily have the other texts. They might not be reading Jane Austen or Middlemarch or Virginia Woolf. And so I felt this kind of entrapment of romance. And at that time in the 70s, even though there was feminism and Gloria Steinem going on out there, and also in the UK, and particularly in London, in this more enclosed world of mainstream popular culture, these magazines being published by a very conservative DC Thompson in Dundee, they would never mention words that were unpleasant. They would never mention words like even sex or same-sex love or lesbian. The word would not exist. The problem page was the key part of the magazine, but clearly there was censorship, no such word as contraception. So it was all about love, and love really was about finding the right kind of boyfriend at the right time, having an engagement ring, which was the sign of status, even if you were just age 16, and imagining a life where at best you might be supporting your boyfriend, you might be cheering him in the football pitch, or you might be completely traumatized because he's going to college and you're staying home, So they were the kind of scenarios that I was really delving into. And I think in the end, I made a persuasive argument about how claustrophobic they were, about how much they were dependent on female subjugation, and about how everything about fashion, the code of fashion in Jackie magazine at the time was, don't take any risks, and, be very subdued, and boys might be put off by somebody with too much mascara, or, everything was about sort of being very meek and mild and unthreatening.
And I think it shows how important that piece of research is, because 45 years ago, it's still being taught in the A-level sociology textbooks today.
Well, and I think that one of the reasons I'm keen to carry on having a discussion about magazines is because magazines are really at the pivot point for the construction of normative femininity in our society. And that's been the case long before Jackie, and it continues to be the case today in 2020. And the magazine is this kind of special place for, as Judith Butler would put it, the crafting and the recrafting of normative femininity on this repetitive basis that also is predicated on generating certain kinds of pleasure and enjoyment. And in the original work, I used, and I still teach this today, I used the Althusserian idea of interpolation because it worked so well. The front cover of the magazine in any newsagents or supermarkets is always like hailing you. It's addressing you as the reader to identify. And very interestingly, some of my Black and ethnic minority students recently in Goldsmiths have really been interested in looking at that process of interpolation from the position of being young Black women. And so they did some very interesting work about, yes, but this interpolation was, this invitation to identify was exclusively, wholly, never was there a Black girl on the cover of Jackie magazine. Yeah. So there was a process of absolute exclusion going on there as well. One could see that almost as a kind of violence of racial oppression, that the construction of the teenage girl, was normatively white. So I'm very interested to update all of that work from the viewpoint of race and ethnicity, also to look at magazines like, the new feminist magazines are terribly interesting, like Missy in Germany, Bitch in Seattle, and Galden here in the UK. So I think the magazine will continue to occupy, even if it's wholly online. It's this very special place for the construction of gender.
Yeah. And it's interesting, like you said, there was nothing like that before you studied girls' magazines, that you were the first to kind of look at that area.
Well, I must say I did it not with a great deal of confidence. I mean, I think that the really difficult thing at that point in time was that one was taking a step into the dark with feminist research, and there wasn't a whole bunch of feminist professors to look at their work. And I think that really had a sense of making one, of kind of confirming a sense of not quite being legitimate, that one was sort of doing something, like a little bit of this and a little bit of that. I mean, obviously, there had been 1 or 2 volumes produced on the magazine. I do remember finding a couple of works, but not more than a couple.
The reason I ask that, if we also think about your work on subcultures, the majority of subcultural work is very much based on males, and your work does look at female subcultures. Why do you think that's such an under-researched area?
Well, there's an interesting story to the article. I think it's called Settling the Accounts with Subcultures, a Feminist Critique. And I wrote that really rapidly in 1979. And it was literally 6 months after Dick Hebdage's magisterial book, Subculture, The Meaning of Style, which is a world bestseller, was published. And also probably it was about a year, 18 months after Paul Willis wrote his book, Learning to Labour, which was likewise massively of world significance. And they were both they were a bit older, they were fellow students at Birmingham. And we had a very kind of embryonic feminist group. There were only about 4 of us, and we were all working on different topics. So it was really quite difficult situate. It was kind of, one felt nervous and about launching into a critique, because they were all very nice guys. But when I read the work of both Hebdage and Paul Willis, I just felt somebody has got to say this. They were attributing to subcultures a real political importance. This was a time of resistance through rituals, and marvelous theoretical work, also from Stuart Hall, because they were arguing that working class boys had, in effect, taken up the class struggle that their parents had abandoned, turned it into a symbolic form through fashion style music, and were therefore embarking through their subcultures on a kind of series of spectacular revolts. So that was the argument, that that the parents, the working class white parents, had stepped back, had acquiesced with capitalism, but their kids, the mods, the rockers, the skinheads, whoever, had somehow had a sense of anger and a sense of class politics. They had absorbed that, and they were then working it out in symbolic terms. So it was a magnificent, really interesting argument. Fashion style, Doc Martens shoes, braces, mod suits. It was brilliant work. But I felt I had to draw attention to not only the fact that these were almost wholly male subcultures, they were always almost wholly male phenomena, but that there was also, so girls were not seen to be there, or if they were there, they were in the shadows, in the background, as I said, on the back of a motorbike perhaps. But there was also sexism deeply encoded within these male bonding, homosocial kind of formations. And that really was all I was wanting to say. And so that was really the crux of the argument in relation to Dick Hebdage's work. And I also, I think, wanted to imply that there wasn't, the question was this sense of class and revolt so equally being played out by young women, or was it more internalized, or were they more acquiescent than their male peers? So that was a question that I did go on to explore. When it came to Paul Willis's work, I mean, Paul Willis was a brilliant ethnographer. There's no doubt it was a great work of ethnography. But I remember at the time being really upset by the language, the sexist and the racist language of these boys. And these were disadvantaged boys. There were boys that weren't going to go into respectable working class jobs. So he was looking at boys that were really on the edge of being thrown out of school, weren't getting qualifications. But their sexist and their racist stance and vocabularies were really shocking. And I drew attention to that. And I think really that article, I mean, it was reprinted here, there, and everywhere because nobody had written from a feminist perspective about subcultures at the time. And I think my male colleagues at Birmingham were quite offended, to be honest. Oh. I think they took it quite harshly. But, a very interesting thing is that, and this, again, is one of the reasons I wanted to do the podcast with you, but just before lockdown, before I got ill, when I was still teaching the first years at Goldsmiths, it wasn't my class, but one of my colleagues had suggested that students read an extract of Paul Willis and go back to it to look at constructions of working class white masculinity. But it wasn't my week. I wasn't teaching, but the students absolutely picked up immediately on how offensive this was. And I then had to get late night onto the web and onto our virtual learning environment to make sure that they didn't feel they had to read it. If they found it unacceptable, I said, don't read it. And then that was and I thought, oh my God. Then I remembered that I'd written a critique of it. Yeah. And I'd completely forgotten. And I couldn't find it. And I couldn't find it on my laptop. I didn't have a copy of it. And then eventually one of my colleagues found it somewhere on the internet and we posted it up. So that's kind of, in a sense, it's interesting how these things go round in circles. And it was the students this time who really absolutely weren't having it. I thought they would make a major complaint about it even being there.
You're a pioneer ahead of your time.
Well, but the thing is, it's not, I don't want to appear grandiose. And it wasn't really that, it was more that at the time there was a really important feminist scholarship happening. And I was just in this really small corner that I'd happened, for the reasons I described earlier, coming through sociology and literature and being in cultural studies, that I happened to kind of develop this set of interests. There was much more substantial feminist sociology being produced elsewhere. There was Anne Oakley's work, there was the work being done in Warwick, there were other centres that were developing very significant, not just feminist sociology, but also feminist theory. And I think really that it was the theory that was needed, because as I said earlier, we were thrashing about looking for concepts and we weren't, as graduate students, really comfortable about just transposing concepts from Marxist theory and from this male canon. And what I think that meant is that other young feminist scholars were doing much more in-depth work to develop a fine theoretical vocabulary. I'm thinking, for example, of Laura Mulvey and the theory of the male gaze. And I'm thinking of Juliet Mitchell and her psychoanalysis and feminism, rereading Freud, and Jacqueline Rose looking at then discovering Lacan and language. So, it was really the theoretical work that really helped develop feminism in the academy at that time.
I wanted to pick up on one point. You mentioned about revolt and cultures of resistance. There's a huge amount of research which talks about cultures of resistance from the male point of view. How did they manifest themselves from the female point of view? What was female revolt or female cultures of resistance?
Good question. Okay, very good question. So I'll try and keep it a little bit briefer. Well, because I was indeed in the 70s kind of trying to think through what is being attributed to masculine cultures of resistance. Is there a female version of it? And one answer to that was the idea that there was a kind of anti-school culture amongst teenage girls, particularly underachieving, working class. At that time, it was mostly white girls in Birmingham. And so I did some work around complete alienation from school on the part of working class girls. And I think I put it in terms of like the girls who would very noticeably bring nail polish and be polishing their nails or applying mascara when they should have been doing their schoolwork, and therefore signaling to the school and to the teachers that they were interested in other things and that those other things were more important than schoolwork. So there was some idea that there was a kind of anti-school culture wherein working class girls, their resistance was to reject the idea of qualifications and they reject the idea of a career, because their career was going to be more traditional and more dependent on a husband and so on. But I always felt a bit dissatisfied with that argument. And I wanted to, if I had done more work, and subsequently other people did a lot more work about the way in which class worked in the school and the way in which girls might have been labelled early on unfairly or seen as underachieving or seen as coming from a background that wasn't going to support them. So I think work that was done subsequent to my work really emphasized the class inequalities in the school system and also in the classroom. So I think that argument really needed more development, and that was carried out. And then it was also carried out in relation to Black young women by my great colleague Anne Phoenix. So that was really just a kind of a bit of an argument about trying to understand why young women really did believe that their options were better by looking for tradition rather than thinking that they might have independence and a good career and a nice job. I mean, that all changed, obviously, 2 decades later, or even 1 decade later. But I think the second argument about resistance, which is that I think punk, actually, despite my critique of Dick Hebdage, I think punk changed absolutely so much. And I think punk femininity was like marvelous and exciting and full of anger, because in Jackie magazine, there was never any space to be angry, because that would put off boys, that would make you unappealing or unattractive. You always had to be smiling, you know, the smile economy. And what was really marvelous about punk was that it let young women really work out their anger, even if they didn't know what it was about. It was really fantastic escape valve for expressing anger about normative femininity, about being expected to be meek and mild and always pleasing. and the kind of constraints of conventional femininity. So now thinking back, possibly what I might have done was written more about punk girls or about punk femininity than I actually did. But, you know, it kind of, yeah, it fed into the next research project that we can talk about in a minute.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because you just mentioned punk. I know you've written extensively about women and music, pop music and rock music as well. I was interested to know how you think that music influences the identities of young women.
Well, I think that thinking back then, there was a much greater chasm or distance between conformity and rebellion. You know, there was a huge gap between the two. And whether that was the same, whether you were a middle class girl or whether you were a working class girl. And that for middle class girls, somehow defining yourself within this left-wing feminist, radical, quite hippie music culture, as I did, really marked an absolute severance with what I would call middle-class Catholic Glasgow, for example. And likewise, I think those girls from working class backgrounds who moved into the punk scene or into the music making punk scene, whether they were like in the Slits or in the Operas or in the Bloods in America or the Delta 5 or whoever, it was a major break. It was a big change in their life, and that changed their outlook, it changed their careers, it changed their sexuality in a big way. And for me, that I think the second argument I made in relation to youth subcultures came quite a lot later, but it was based on my observations all the way throughout. And the people I was talking with, I mean, I was hanging about with a lot of female punk musicians. They were kind of some of my best friends at the time. So I was kind of going to gigs all the time. But what I became aware of was that really youth cultures from the early 80s, right through the 80s, really were becoming a kind of, as I put it, an informal job centre. Really what I was observing was that the girls who made the break into these music scenes or into, for example, developing skills, doing graphic designs for flyers, making fanzines, mostly, from my observations, doing second-hand vintage clothes, providing the kind of punks with their clothes for gigs and for everyday life, that they were actually kind of acquiring skills. And so they became really forms of, there were two terms I used. One was that they were becoming like almost like subcultural entrepreneurs because they were working independently. This was like indie fashion or like indie music. They were setting up stalls in Camden Market or in Birmingham rag markets and all up and down the country. And so there was a sense in which these were very largely girls who became punks were usually full of energy and full of drive and full of kind of enthusiasm and both anger and very observant. And so they began to do things that almost became like careers, like journalism, making fanzines, taking photographs, making magazines, doing flyers, doing promotion, doing gigs, and so on. So that then led into, there was a couple of articles, but the one that I think was most summed it up was called Second-Hand Dresses and the Role of the Rag Market. And actually, I have to say, that article also got me into a bit of trouble with the kind of old Marxist left guys, because they had been full of enthusiasm about revolt and resistance. But when I started saying, look, they're making a living, this is entrepreneurial, you know, this is about, this is production of, and they're selling them, then this was like really not acceptable to the Marxist left. And again, I find myself, you know, somewhat shunned. But actually, that then became the kernel of a lot of my recent work on the fashion industry, on micro enterprises, and really what I argue is that in Britain, fashion design was predicated on youth subcultures, which most people now would agree with. But the other important argument that I made was that youth subcultures flourished at a point in time where working class kids and black kids were, by and large, getting into universities. It was pre-Tony Blair's 50%. So the kinds of young people that I knew in Birmingham, or indeed in London, all the people that were in bands, they were from poorer working class backgrounds or the disadvantaged families who weren't going to say, oh, you must do your A-levels and get into Birmingham University. It's a good red brick university and you can study dentistry. That was way off the mark. But by the end of the 80s and the early 90s, the polytechnics were beginning to widen the access to disadvantaged youngsters. So the people that I was studying from the mid-70s to almost the end of the 80s, their equivalent a few years later would be doing degrees in performing arts, music production. They would be going to Westminster University, they would be going to Brighton, they would be going to Manchester Metropolitan. So in effect, they did become professionalised. Yeah. Their interests, they would be doing fashion design.
And did some of that work lead you to your writing about moral panics as well? I know you did some work with Sarah Thornton.
Sarah Thornton. Yes, it did, actually. And the connection was that Sarah Thornton's wonderful book, Club Culture, and so she was younger than me, she's still a good friend of mine, and she came from Canada to do her PhD with Simon Frizz up in Scotland on rave culture and club culture. And then she came to live in London to follow up her ethnography, and that was really where I got to know her. And her argument also was seen as quite controversial because she was saying something similar, which is that raves and 5,000 people dancing in a field was also producing its own economy. Yeah. It was a microeconomy, and it was DJ culture was producing this kind of subcultural huge economy based around music, nighttime economy, leisure, drinks, and so on. And she also argued, which went against the grain, that these were not homogeneous cultures of resistance, but they also produced, as Bourdieu put it, their own hierarchies. And so they were in many ways full of distinctions, what kind of club, and are you the right kind of person to get into this kind of club? So Sarah Thornton argued, and I didn't completely agree, but she felt that the Birmingham work was romanticized, and it romanticized youth working class culture. And I think there was a degree of that. And she wanted to say, hold on a minute, these are just as capitalist as, they're mimicking. They're a kind of micro-capitalism, micro-enterprises. And so she drew attention using Bourdieu to distinctions like, are you on the guest list? So that was one argument. But then she also showed how this new DJ culture generated its own moral panics, and it wanted to be on the front page of the Sun because that would then produce this kind of moral panic of attraction and allure to 15-year-olds who wanted to. So she argued that rave culture kind of implemented moral panic theory in order to increase their market.
Yes.
So, which was a great argument, and we were talking about it. And then I made the argument, it was first in New Left Review, which was actually more about the media. And what I argued in the first version of that was that folk devils, that is to say, the stigmatized minorities, were beginning to fight back. So the first version of that article was called Folk Devils Fight Back. And what I was arguing is that as the media became more extensive, more sophisticated, more reflexive. Social groups who found themselves stigmatized, for example, single moms or drug takers, began to develop their own media skills in order to produce a coherent voice and to have a place in that discussion. So that really was what I was saying. They developed their own groups, their own self-help groups, their own campaigns, their own pressure groups to defend their interests and also broadcast those interests.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you. That has taken us from your work from the mid-70s all the way up to the late 80s. So I think that is going to be absolutely fantastic as a part one. I really look forward to recording a part two with you soon, which will look at some of your more contemporary work.
Good. Okay.
Just in time being, do you mind just giving out your details, just in case people want to get in touch, your email or your Twitter handle?
My email address is a.mcrobbie@gold.ac.uk, and my Twitter is just #Angela McRobbie.
Brilliant. Thank you, Angela. And I really look forward to recording part two with you soon.
Well, thank you. That was quite enjoyable. So I hope it was of interest to you. Very nice to talk to you.
Yeah, very nice. And we'll arrange a time to do part two whenever suits you. That would be really good.
Okay. Bye. Bye.
If you are a regular listener to The Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to continue keep the show going and growing. Best wishes and keep enjoying the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email thesociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.